Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tenpenny Files. I'm your host, Dr. Sherri Tenpenny. Here on the Tenpenny Files, we dive into vital and often controversial discussions on topics that will challenge what you've been told and reveal what's been hidden. These compelling conversations will make you think, spark debate, and hopefully inspire you to action. Join me here each day at 3 p.m. Eastern Time to hear from authors and documentary filmmakers who have something important to say that have often been censored or silenced. Today's conversation is with my guest, child welfare activist, attorney, and co-founder for Stand for Health Freedom, Leah Wilson. And she is also the author of an upcoming book, Reclaim Vitality, a guide to exit conventional medicine and live naturally. However, she's not here to talk about her book today. We're going to do that at a later date. I invited her to be on the show because I heard her presentation at the Healing for the Ages conference, Dr. Brian Ardis's conference in October of 2025. And her topic was From Margin to Mainstream. It was one of the most jaw-dropping presentations I think I have ever heard. And I asked her to join me here today on the Tenpenny Files to share this information with you, to expose the next battle of what is before us, about our children, about humanity, and it is absolutely huge. So Leah, welcome so much to the Tenpenny Files, and thank you for joining us here today.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Tenpenny. Thank you for having me. It's great.
It'll be good. So let's dig right in. We're hearing that the NIH wants to add full genome sequencing to newborn screening. What is whole genome sequencing, and what does it actually mean in practice?
Yeah, so genome sequencing means that you are looking at the DNA of a child. What genes exist? What are the genetic markers? How do they differ from the reference genome, which is a genome that is used to determine if yours is different? And it's just a single genome that they picked out that they compare everyone else's against. And the reason why this is startling is simply because the biosurveillance system that is in the works will be wildly incomplete without this, but very dangerous with this type of information, because you and I both know that getting people to comply with processes, medical processes like this at day one of life, within that 24 to 48-hour mark of a newborn, that is one of the most vulnerable times in a mother's journey, in a child's life, and taking this type of information and using it for profit, and then who knows how else for the child, for the rest of that child's life, is an extremely powerful tool for those that hold it.
Well, with the advent of testings like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, many people will think that this is a great idea. The more I know about my genes and how my genes might affect me, is so much better. And people will think this is a really great idea to find out about the genetic markers in their children from the time they're born. Why is that not true?
That's the problem, is because there's a lie built into that, saying, well, this knowledge is knowledge that we need for your child to live a long, healthy life. We don't know. We don't know what these genes ultimately mean for a child, because there's only three disorders that have been identified where the medical community says that it's 100% penetrant. Penetrant means that the presence of this gene will end up in definitively the presentation of a certain disease or dysfunction. And that's Tay-Sachs, dwarfism, and Huntington's disease. Outside of that, if you have the gene, it is unknown whether or not it will ever lead to complications. And if it does lead to complications, will it be mild, moderate, or severe? So this knowing gives way too much weight to the unknown. I mean, if you look at the Human Genome Project, which I'm sure you're familiar with, it wildly underperformed. We expected to get out on the other side of the multiple years of studying this and billions of dollars poured into the Human Genome Project, knowing the presence of A, B, and C gene always leads to E, F, and G. And that's just not what we saw. We saw that the presence of genes is somewhere between 3 and 10% determinative, and that the environment is what is determinative in the expression of genes. So yes, even though knowledge is power, we all agree on that, but taking one of the biggest lies of all times, that you are what your genes are, and acting like this is the knowledge that parents needs is predatory. I mean, it's preying on a vulnerable time in that mother's life and convincing them that their child needs a highly experimental intervention in order to survive. I mean, you probably remember Back to the Future. I think it was Back to the Future 2 when Doc Brown warns Marty not to interact with the future self. He says, don't do it. There's too many problems. It'll cause too many problems because it is undetermined by us. And it's like, why are we ignoring that it's not our job to go into the future and predict things and change our future today based on a set of unknowns? And I don't know if that resonates with you, but I would hate to see mothers put an identity and a ceiling on their children at day one of life because of the presence of a gene.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said was so key, that even if you have a genetic indication or genetic inclination to something, it's the epigenetics that determine whether or not that gene becomes activated. Epigenetics meaning the diet, the environment, the vaccines that you get, the things that you're all exposed to will say whether or not that gene manifests into something. And even more key of what you already said was, will that be mild, moderate, or severe? And yet, I can just see it now. Doctors will walk in the room and go, your baby has this disease in the future. We've got to do something to intercept with this right now. And then the biggest problem is that the DNA sequencing, the treatment for it is this gene editing, gene therapy. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and I just want to help hit that idea home of epigenetics, because if you take two identical twins, so genetically identical twins, and separate them at birth, the studies have shown that if you follow them through life, some things are the same, like their hair color, their eye color, their height, but not their health. And their health was determined by two primary things, and that's who raised them and how they lived. And, we all have this inclination that no, it really is true. Genetics are determinative because obesity runs in my family or diabetes runs in my family, and so, yes, that is true that who raises you matters and how you live matters, but it's not the presence of the gene by itself. And depending on your worldview, as for me and my family, we see the body is always doing the right thing at the right time. And that presence of that quote unquote gene mutation could be a smart adaptation that is working to the benefit of that child. And then to try to go and leap over that and fix it is, so there are different ways to look at this. And for moms to be funneled into a single way that's missing a big part of the story is startling. So you were asking about the gene therapies, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
when I think of gene therapy, you have to acknowledge that none of us are currently strangers to gene therapy because of mRNA. Because who celebrated the day that the FDA issued the EUA for the mRNA COVID vax? It wasn't the vaccine industry that celebrated. It was the gene therapy industry. They were holding a conference when that announcement was made, and from stage, they said, this is a watershed moment for our industry. This was a turning point that now we had a global rollout of gene therapy. And what have we seen since then? We have seen an enormous fallout in heart health, brain health, turbo cancers, fertility issues. And we haven't even been able to calculate the harm from that public experiment yet. So it's looking at, okay, so we know what gene therapy is and how powerful it is. And then to apply that technology to a healthy newborn that does not yet have symptoms is wildly risky. And have you ever heard of Jesse Gelsinger?
Maybe.
She
Tell me.
he is a young man who was a participant in a safety trial for gene therapy when he was in his late teens. And the reason why he entered this gene therapy safety trial was because he had a very mild form of an ammonia processing disorder. So he couldn't process the protein properly, which made his ammonia build up if he wasn't taking nitrogen scavengers, right? So it was Jesse's disorder was being completely managed by diet and nitrogen scavengers. And he lived a normal life outside of that. And they approached him and said, Jesse, you can save newborns that are going to be born with the same genetic disorder you have if you come participate in the safety trial. And it's a gene therapy, and the side effects would be flu-like symptoms. But since you've survived the flu before, we think you'll be just fine. And so Jesse flew from Arizona to Pennsylvania to participate in this trial. And 4 days later, he was gone. And his death back in the 90s shocked the gene therapy community to the point that human trials were paused for 20 years after Jesse's death. And Jesse's family was not told that the monkeys in the trials of his gene therapy had either passed away or had to be euthanized. You know, they weren't given that sort of information before they agreed to this safety trial to save other newborns. And I think the industry had a dramatic but appropriate response when they were shocked by his death. And fast forward to today with the rise in technology and AI and screening, and we are now ignoring deaths. I mean, there have been 6 pediatric deaths in 2025 alone, but yet we're pushing gene therapy and cell therapy as cures. I mean, that's how you're hearing it in the news, is that we now have gene and cell therapy to cure these rare genetic diseases. But they aren't mentioning that these quote unquote cures are highly experimental and that there's no long-term safety or efficacy data on these interventions that are being given to our youngest family members.
You know, when they first started talking about the mRNA, the COVID jabs, calling them gene therapy, when they first started talking about that, that always disturbed me. I mean, just the term gene therapy, because when you think about therapy is generally something that's good for you. It's like physical therapy, speech therapy, you know, art therapy, you know, all those different things. So that really bothered me, and it had been bothering me for a long time. So I started looking into that, and I found out, and I actually wrote about this on my Substack on drtenpenny.substack.com. It was a few months ago now that I published this article. And it actually started in the term gene therapy actually started in the late 1800s, when they were actually starting to have their first genetic conferences. And they were actually, these genetic conferences that they were having was actually for plants, because they were, you know, it was like the yellow and blue plant makes a green plant, you know, and they were looking at when they would breed these different plants. And they were talking about genetic modification of these plants because of being able to breed them in a certain way to end up with a certain outcome. Well, then they started talking about genetic modification of humans, and they started doing things during that time. It was like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, about genetic modification of humans. And it was met by a lot of resistance, that people didn't like that term, because what are we going to do? We're going to genetically modify humans. So they changed the term to gene therapy, because that was more widely accepted. And as instead of saying genetic modification of humans, we will now call it gene therapy, because it's softer and it became more widely accepted. But that's from my research, the original things that I found about that. And it was just made it even more creepy to think now that this is like, in what you just said, that this was like a watershed moment. You know, another thing that I think is a watershed moment, I remember you talking about at the Ages Conference, because we're talking about getting mothers at the most vulnerable time, is this big project that they're going to do in Florida, that they're going to test like tell us about that, because that just resonated in my head. I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, and the whole gene therapy notion is, it's important to recognize that gene therapy fits squarely within biotech, which is like the future of pharmaceuticals. It is the future of medicine. And what is biotech? It's biology with technology. It's putting technology in your biology. You know, when people want to hear about they don't, I don't know if people want to hear about it. I shouldn't say it that way, but they're mind blown by transhumanism agendas and things of this nature. But if you look at the impetus of biotech, it is fixing or overtaking your human biology with man's technology. And it's a very important thing to appreciate, because that genetic modification will always have systemic and widespread effects. I mean, it's not, they pretend like they can go in, just like they did with vaccines, Dr. Tenpenny. They focused on achieving their goal of snuffing out the symptoms of measles without even acknowledging the unintended effects. So if you look at quote unquote genetic modification through gene therapy transfusions, are they even looking at or measuring or acknowledging the off mark effects of those genes that are also changed that were not the intention of that genetic therapy? Are they reporting on that? Are they looking at which genes are altered, or just simply measuring if the one that they wanted to change was changed? And there are some distinctions between the gene and cell therapies with, which ones go into the liver to train the genes to change one by one and which ones fix it immediately. And it's really scientific imagination, the things that they are claiming to do with these technologies. I mean, it's literally their imagination. There's no proof in the pudding yet. And that's what we need people to know, is that if you are participating in the screenings that lead to these types of things, you need to know what it is you're participating in, that it's not a cure, it's an experiment.
Well, and the other thing is that gene therapy, we have this, again, this imagination that it's like laser focus, that we want to change this gene, and when we inject this, it's going to go right there like a magnet. It's just going to go right to that thing, which is just a big lie. It doesn't happen that way.
Right. Right. And do we know if it happens that way, even if that's what they're intending, because it hasn't been measured yet? I mean, there haven't been the long-term surveys and studies done, but the Florida Sunshine Genetics Act. So how is the industry going to create the population that is going to utilize all these biotech solutions, all these gene therapy solutions that have big price tags? I mean, the price tag of Zolgensma, which is the therapy recommended for a positive spinal muscular atrophy screen at birth, is $2.1 million for a single shot. One shot, $2.1 million, covered by, Medicare, Medicaid, CMS. And so you have to think, okay, well, what is going to be the funnel into the use of these products? And it's the newborn screening. But the newborn screening alone, it's not enough. So they're looking to transform the newborn screening into whole genome sequencing. And what that looks like is, instead of just taking a few biomarkers that most of the things on the genetic screening list, or the newborn screening list, I apologize, are for biomarkers that are maybe metabolic dysfunctions that have early treatments. But if you expand that into the whole genome sequencing to look at genetic things that can quote unquote be fixed, you're looking at adding like 700 markers to a newborn screen to see what all is wrong with your healthy newborn. And when we saw this start to roll out, it really sparked my attention when the funding, all these grants, started being reallocated away from gene therapy and directly to newborn screening. So it's like, oh, so there is a connection here. There's a partnership here between these gene therapies and the newborn screening. And then we started seeing this pilot program that was being pushed by NIH to put whole genome sequencing in the newborn screening program to fix all the rare genetic conditions. So Florida is the first state to pass the Sunshine Genetics Act to fund whole genome sequencing in newborn screening. So if you're in the state of Florida, they're doing this through Florida State University. I believe that's the university that's heading it up. And they're going to roll it out through hospital systems across the state. You might be offered whole genome sequencing for your newborn screen in Florida, even today or tomorrow. And the question is, how are they maintaining informed consent of what this means? for that mother and that child? And what are the conversations that are happening before birth or after a positive screen? Because the implications are great. In rolling this out in the state of Florida shows that there is a will and a way to make this the norm for pediatric care. The NIH is rolling it out in 2 hospital systems per state as we speak. So that's the NIH fund that was issued in October, was to take 2 hospital systems across the 50 states within each state to put whole genome sequencing as an option with newborn screening.
If I remember right, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they were going to test 300,000 babies, but it wasn't really defined what they found in their DNA. It was how readily would mothers agree to this testing. Did I remember that correctly from your presentation?
Yes, they did use that number in Florida, that their goal was to get 300,000 mothers to consent to this whole genome sequencing as a part of their newborn screening. You know, the newborn screening, if the listeners aren't familiar, is the little heel prick at 24 hours old, which I have a funny story, not funny story, but an interesting story about that 24-hour mark too, because so they're going to do the heel prick not before 24 hours, but between 24 and 48 to get the drops of blood and send it into the public health lab to see if your child has any of these metabolic disorders that can be helped earlier in life. So now they want, and that's mandatory. That's mandatory. You have to know your right to opt out of it if you don't want to participate in it. But this whole genome sequencing supposedly is going to be opt-in, but it's with the newborn screening program. And so saying we're going to have 300,000 mothers participate, and what we're watching for is why the moms do or do not trust this. They want to measure the mother's trust in the whole genome sequencing and in this program so that they can build the program responsive to the mom's willingness to participate. So instead of looking at how does a family benefit, what are the risks, how many people end up having a positive screen and needing a treatment, and did the treatment help? Like, you think that those would be the things that are being measured in a pilot program, not the trust of a mother. It reminds me of the vaccine hesitancy research that was funded by our federal government for years.
100%. I was just thinking that as you were saying it, because they would do all these like vaccine hesitancy, and then they would try to figure out what was the best language, what was the best manipulation. Was it a carrot or a stick approach, to the mothers to get them to comply with the vaccine stuff? And then the other thing that is so frightening about that, not only are they trying to figure out ways to best manipulate mothers into the system, but where does that DNA go? Who houses it? What happens? Who controls it? Who owns that DNA once it is now in a federal database?
Well, that's one of the biggest reasons Stanford Health Freedom opposes putting whole genome sequencing in newborn screening, is because currently the newborn screen data goes to your state public health lab, right? And the public health labs operate under a patchwork of laws depending on your state. But the genomic data, what they're supporting and funding, is the creation of a central national database so that now a newborn's genome would be stored at the federal level with every other American baby, which in the intent, even in the law that's on Congress's desk right now, so the bill that's on their desk, it says that they will track long-term health outcomes and compliance, and that part of the funds will go to following up with mothers on the compliance of the positive screens. And so if that information is being held in a central database, what can it eventually be connected to? I mean, we're all concerned about digital ID. I don't know my genome right now, so certainly Google and the federal government don't know it. But if we start this type of screen and we centralize it in a database, then the federalized genomic surveillance system would start at day one of life. And even bigger, let's say our government never weaponizes the data. Let's say our government's completely trustworthy and they defend the database and they keep it secure. It could be a target for U.S. enemies. I mean, what is more vulnerable and sensitive and personal than your genome and the surveillance and security risks that would come along with that. I mean, can you imagine one of our enemies getting a hold of that and saying, look, we have the greatest positive screens for this disease or this vulnerability in the state of Michigan. So we could target Michigan with this or target Iowa with that. And to have that sort of information that is centralized is completely ripe for abuse, not only by our own government and whatever they might be able to use it for, but by our foreign enemies. And China is leading the way in this global genomics race. So we've spent years fighting China's harmful agendas and protecting ourselves from China's harmful agendas. And now we're signing up to participate in China's own genomics race.
Ooh, this is so deep, and we've got more to go and more to cover. But for right now, I think everybody needs to take a deep breath, and we're going to take a short break. So hold that thought, Leah. We're going to hear from our sponsors for AmericaOutloud.news. America Loud Talk Radio plays the Tenpenny Files on iHeartRadio Network daily at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can also listen from the AmericaOutloud.news media player anywhere in the world. And if you've missed any of these great conversations that we've been having since we've started the Tenpenny Files, you can also find them on Spotify, Pandora, Apple, TuneIn, iHeart Virtual Studio, and on many other platforms, including the drtenpenny.com. My platform, and you just click on the Substack on the podcast tab, and it will open right up for you. So that is another place, and we also post them every day on our Substack. Because there are so many great books, so many documentaries, and so little time to read and watch, we are hoping that this show will bring you highlights of conversations and ideas that you're not familiar with, and will bring you new understanding to books that you probably wouldn't just pull off the shelf as you walked in the door. So we're going to hear right now from our sponsors that keep the Tenpenny Files online and keep the AmericaOutloud.news online. Sit tight. We have more conversation that's coming about this horrible new genomic testing with our good friend, Leah Wilson, who's the co-founder of Stand for Health Freedom. We will be right back. Zeolite is a detox spray. We work specifically with a company called Touchstone Essentials. They are an incredible company. We've been working with them now for several years. And zeolite is a mineral that goes through your body like a one-way basket. It will clean out heavy metals such as arsenic and mercury, aluminum, cadmium, and it hooks onto those metals from a one-way perspective. So once it's bound, it goes out through your urine or your stools and doesn't get redeposited in other places. Everybody needs to have a detox product in their life, and this one is so easy to use, and it's so safe. You can take it when you're pregnant, you can take it when you're nursing, you can give it to little children, you can even give it to infants, and quite frankly, I give it to my dog. I actually put a little bit of the zeolite in his water, because until we all stop living in a toxic world, we all need to get some of those extra toxicities out. The heavy metals, the persistent organic pollutants, the things that are floating through the air, the different things that we come in touch with in our environment. And we are a big fan of zeolite from Touchstone Essentials. We've been a big fan of their products for several years. Go to drtenpenny.com/detox to get your first bottle of zeolite spray for $50 off.
Well, only when the government bows to the people will America become great again. This is Malcolm Out Loud here. Join me in pushing back against censorship, my fellow Americans. Right at the top of AmericaOutloud.news are the words: many voices, one freedom, united in the First Amendment. Now is our time, my fellow Americans. AmericaOutloud.news, liberty and justice for all.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking with Leah Wilson, the co-founder of Stand for Health Freedom, about her discovery of NIH's fighting plan, horrible plan, to add full genomic sequencing to newborn screening. Let me tell you a little bit more about Leah Wilson. She's the executive director and co-founder for Stand for Health Freedom. She's an attorney, child welfare advocate, and expert on medical mandates and parental rights. Stand for Health Freedom is a premier political activist organization and is currently suing the CDC in a historic case, which we will get to in just a few more minutes. She lives in Indiana with her husband. Dr. Nick Wilson, a natural health physician, radio host, and USA Olympic wellness advisor. So Leah, why is this shift in newborn screening such a really going to put the whole thing is about long-term medical control. I'm very, very concerned about who owns this DNA and how it can be monetized and how it can never be fully anonymous. And I'm also concerned, I know this is a two-part question, so I'm concerned about that anonymity. But you mentioned at the first part of the show about that they're going to be following the sequencing, following what happens. I'm wondering what happens if your newborn comes up with an adverse finding of this big screening that they do, and they recommend a $2.1 million gene therapy. What happens if parents say, no, thank you, I don't want to do that? So who owns it? How do they monetize it? What happens if they refuse the therapy?
So, I mean, the newborn DNA has been a hot commodity for decades. I mean, newborn screening is 60 years old. I think that was as of this year. And that DNA has been stored at the state level. And then there's been questions for a very long time about who is bought and sold to and who is allowed to do quote unquote public health research on this. But what we're going to see with this shift with the whole genome sequencing is for this data to cross state lines from the outset, for it to be all 50 states in one single database, which I'm sure a lot of your audience is concerned about the real ID and the rise of digital ID. How would this affect the completion of that profile and how that profile on that person can be used if we have a central database that can be connected to something like a digital ID or a real ID? And we don't know who ultimately will get their hands on that data. I mean, the ownership of health data is so nebulous. People oftentimes think that HIPAA is protecting us and is making sure that our data is safe if it's health data. And sadly, it's quite the opposite. I mean, the P in HIPAA stands for portability. And we've shown people, our lawmakers and our advocates, these graphs that were published post-COVID about what happens to public health data. And newborn screening is right in the middle of that. This robust amount of public health data that goes out to research institutions and public health labs and to the DMVs and Child Protective and the schools and all these different agencies and institutions that don't even have anything to do with the government. I mean, they're simply justifying the sale of this data for public health research to the benefit of the public. So having DNA in a central database, it cannot be de-identified. It's personal information. Like, how do you take the identity out of a person's DNA?
Well, Twyla Braze is a regular on this show, and she's been a regular on my podcast for the last couple of years. And she's, the lead campaigner against the real ID and what we need to do because that is the final step before the central bank digital currency and then programmable currency. And now we're going to wrap it into our genetics. And she was, when I first met her years ago, she was really talking then about the problems with the newborn screening and the heel stick and who owns that little drop of blood once it goes in there. So like you said, this has been going on for a really long time. I'm wondering how the results of these tests could affect a child in later life, like education, employment, medical care. I mean, if they say, well, they're going to end up with this really deadly disease later, and we don't have money in the system to care for Huntington's chorea or whatever it turns out to be, maybe it would just be good right now if we just euthanize your baby. Is that even like going to be on the plate for options for parents?
I mean, the imagination can only tell us how all this could be weaponized or abused. And that's why I think it's important for us to understand that the benefit, what you said at the beginning of the show is, well, Leah, don't you want to know? Shouldn't we just at least know? And it's like the benefit of that knowing with the tools that we have is so low, and the risk of harvesting that data and having that data stored at a central level is so high. Not just the data being out there, but the solutions they're going to give you, which is begs the question of, will declining gene editing your healthy newborn be looked at the same as declining chemotherapy for a pediatric patient or a child with a cancer diagnosis? We get calls at Stanford Health Freedom all the time about medical kidnapping because the mother didn't trust the medical intervention that was recommended to her in response to a horrible diagnosis or a medical event. And so she wanted to go explore other routes. And that, the medical system takes that very seriously, that they see the medical approach and the medical fix as the only option, and anything outside of it as negligence. So we're multiplying opportunities for that type of disagreement between the industry and the parent by doing whole genome sequencing of a healthy newborn. We're not talking about a languishing newborn that we're trying to get to the bottom of something or they're failing to thrive. We're talking about a healthy newborn that the mother should simply nurse and hold and nurture and take home and plan on things going well. That's who we're talking about. And then giving a grave diagnosis and saying, well, now the solution is to edit their genes. What will happen when mom opts out? What will the hubris be of the medical industry, of the scientific community, to say that there is no other option?
Wow, this is just so evil. I mean, when I first heard you talking about this at the Aegis conference, I was just jaw dropped, and I knew that we needed to get this information out to a much broader level. When you are, let's say that a mother opts in because she is naive to the long-term potential consequences of what this could be. And she's like, well, yeah, I'd like to know my baby's genetics. Once it's in that database, is there any way of getting it out, or is it in there forever?
Well, that's a good question. And those are answers we don't yet have because this is just now being funded. So the database is being funded by Congress right now. The bill is on their desk. And if this goes into that federal database, once that information is there, and we don't know exactly who all will have access to it. A lot of times these contracts are written in ways that say that the information can be utilized for public health purposes. That's kind of a catch-all bucket to say that we can study the population in order to improve the health outcomes of the population. And that's where it gets really sticky, is because once that information leaves you and you consent for it to leave you and for it to be used for quote unquote public health purposes, we can't track it down everywhere that it is. It's not, you're incapable of knowing who all has access to that information and for what purposes. So taking it back could be a logistical capability. I mean, you could say, okay, I want this removed. I want the file. I want to opt out, because there are bills that say we have to have the ability to take our data back. States are passing those types of laws, even for health data. But what does that actually mean? Taking it back out of a single database? Because you can't make information disappear once it's out there, especially when we know that this is extremely valuable information for the development of new medical products, for the research on our population to see what our greatest vulnerabilities are. It's the type of information that is extremely rich and extremely valuable, but also very personal. So I would just challenge moms to, when you're presented with this option, that any option for any type of screening, not just whole genome sequencing, that you read through the consent to see where the information will go and how it can be used. Because when there's broad language in there, such as for public health purposes or for the furtherance of care, you've really lost control and any say of that data. And so we would just encourage you to, A, before you do a screen, know how the screen is going to be used, and B, know what possible benefit could the screen be for you and your child. Because if on the other end of that positive screen, you're not going to want their solutions, then I would suggest you don't screen. Because if you don't want their solutions, then what value is the information to you other than to mess with your expectations and to manifest things? I mean, manifest not in a weird sense, but the mind is powerful, and what you expect to happen happens. Have you ever heard of this nocebo effect experiment where they took individuals who were going to be given chemotherapy, and there were a subset of these individuals who were not qualified for chemotherapy. So they just received saline instead, but they were told in advance, you're going to receive this transfusion and you will most likely have hair loss, vomiting, and mouth sores. That's the side effects. Well, the cohort that received the saline solution still experienced the hair loss, the vomiting, and the mouth sores because that is what they were expecting to experience. And that's the power of getting news like this for your healthy newborn at day 1 of life.
Wow, that is so powerful. It's sort of like when they wanted to make BRCA gene testing, for whether or not it was predictive for breast cancer, which it's really not, and that's a completely different topic and discussion. But if it turned out to be positive, it would just be like, do I have a ticking time bomb sitting on my chest? And maybe I need to get rid of both of my breasts just because this might happen to 1 out of 8 women down the road. Am I the one? And it just kind of, cogitates and turns and turns and turns. And that's such a powerful example that you gave about the chemotherapy, because if you think that your child is going to develop this disease down the road and you think about it and you're focused on it, I just can't. It's just is so upsetting to me because I know exactly what you're saying, and it is really, really bad. And remember that for the listener, what Leah said earlier, that these gene therapies for this one genetic gene thing, one dose is $2.1 million.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens if you decide, yes, I want to do it, but I don't have $2.1 million laying around in my piggy bank to do that? Then what? What happens then?
Yes, and I've listened to so many stories of families who have gotten positive screens and then they sit and wait and they feel like their life is on pause and they're holding in their breath, through every day of their child's life, just waiting for the resources and the ability to make these things happen. And it's devastating. You bring up a good point about BRCA. I think it's actually a very good illustration of understanding that genes are not our destiny, that we've been lied to about that. Yeah. Because I remember when, the Angelina Jolie effect and everyone was having these very extreme procedures as a preventative measure. And then I had my mom pass away of ovarian cancer and my grandmother, and her oncologist looked at me as I'm sitting in the room and said, "We need to get you on preventative chemotherapy right away." And I said, "Oh, I'm not here to be your patient. Like, that's my mom. We're here for her." And they were like, "No, but they tried to put the fear of God in me." So I knew at that point in time that what had been spoken over me, that I needed to go home and dig deep into what these genes mean. I declined the screen because it wasn't going to change how I lived my life. It wasn't going to change that I ate healthy foods and exercised and drank clean water and thought good thoughts, So I was like, I don't need the screen. But going home to say and teach myself and teach my cells that BRCA is actually protective of dozens of other things.
Exactly.
It's like you're told that you have BRCA, you're broken, and we need to fix you. But you're not told that BRCA is actually protective of a dozen other cancers. And so it's just important that we have the whole picture in order to ever give actual consent for how we want to live. So it's just, I think it's brilliant that you bring up BRCA because it's an illustration to prove that you are not your genes.
Exactly. Well, in the few minutes that we have left here, I want to change gears just a little bit and talk about Stand for Health Freedom, a little bit about what you do, and this lawsuit that you have filed with the CDC. So we've got a few minutes left. Why don't we talk about that?
Absolutely. And this lawsuit is truly foundational. It's the first of its kind. And the reason we filed it, Dr. Tenpenny, is because more and more people are waking up to understand that the word vaccine and decision really belong together. That it is a mother's decision to decide if her child is a good candidate or needs any one of these 72 doses that's on the schedule. So if you look at the way the schedule is currently set up at the federal level, they are universal recommendations for every American child. And that has not been studied, and the schedule as a whole has not been studied to know its cumulative effect on any given American child. So we told the court, look, these are bad agency decisions. They did not consider a very salient fact when making this agency decision to put this dose next to this dose, next to this dose on this one childhood schedule. So therefore, we need to take all of these doses and make them individual recommendations so that the risks and the benefits are assessed at every single encounter. And so we think that we have a really good chance at seeing a big shift with the childhood schedule, exposing these agency decisions as reckless and bad and unconstitutional, since the fact of long-term effects of the schedule and cumulative effects have never been considered by our government. And if we win that, it would really dismantle the whole construct of mandates, because all the states across the U.S. are referring to this pediatric schedule as the guide for the mandates. And that's what's exciting. And we saw ACIP a couple weeks ago. ACIP spent 2.5 hours discussing these very things. So we filed the lawsuit August 15th, and then the ACIP meeting on December 4th and 5th. We saw a lot of that language used and a lot of these things considered by the committee in charge of the childhood schedule.
What's the status of the lawsuit right now?
So we filed in August, and then right when the answer was due, the government shutdown happened. So it got kicked out until January. So the government has until January to either file for an extension to answer or to answer the lawsuit. We hope that we will see some type of quality response, even from the agencies that acknowledge that these changes need to happen. Maybe they won't need litigated all the way through. Maybe because of who is in the administration right now, we can see some common sense take foot if we give them the recipe for success to make that happen.
Yeah, it's common sense. You know, for years I've said I wanted to create a bumper sticker that said common sense ain't so common.
Yeah.
That's really kind of true. And we
got to be our own experts. We got to start thinking like you teach us to in order for common sense to take foot.
Exactly. In our last couple of seconds, Leah, tell us about Stand for Health Freedom and the wonderful stuff your organization does.
So standforhealthfreedom.com, we are an action center to help you make a difference in your state and your towns on health freedom. So when we set up Stand for Health Freedom, our desire was really to give a meaningful voice to the health freedom voting block so that we can get pro-parental rights, pro-privacy, informed consent, religious freedom, and free speech policies in place in every state across the U.S. because the parents that we hear from, that's what they want. They want strong parental rights. They want to be the ones that make decisions for their children's health, and they want privacy in place so that those decisions are never used against them. So we've been at this now since 2019, and we have 147 policy wins under our belt, and we've helped elect over 1,200 health freedom candidates into office, which that's thanks to all of our supporters. And that is how we pave the way for real change, is by getting the right people into office and using our voices to show up and shape these policies. Because if you don't show up, the only voice that will be shaping policies is the industry's voice. So it's incumbent upon us to take action and bring forward our concerns as moms and dads and teachers and doctors.
And where can people go to support your work? Because I think you're a 501c3, right?
So Stand for Health Freedom is a C4, and Health Freedom Institute is our sister organization, which is a C3. So we have healthfreedominstitute.com or standforhealthfreedom.com, and one is dedicated to education and the other to advocacy, but it goes toward educating on the key issues of the day. You know, right now our battles ahead are things like no more medical mandates, getting fluoride out of water, deregulating small-scale farming, digital ID. And then the fifth one is strengthening parental rights in light of school-based health centers and the rise of mental health care in schools.
You guys have just come so far from where you started, and you're just such a powerhouse. Your whole organization is, and what you're doing is just great. What is as we just close up here in the last couple of minutes, what's your takeaway from this message today? What would you advocate to people who are listening to this?
Yes, I think that the whole genome sequencing and newborn screening could be bigger than the childhood vaccine schedule if we allow it to take root in our states. And it's going to be incumbent upon us to know what is being offered, to talk about it, and to make an intentional decision. Because if this becomes a part of newborn screening, this veil of darkness will be thick, and the biotech solutions that they have for our healthy newborns will be devastating. So I want to encourage everyone to just go to standforhealthfreedom.com and join, and we're going to give you the recipe for success to take action and make our voices heard on this issue so that it does not proceed under a veil of darkness like the childhood schedule did for decades.
So brilliant. So brilliant. And I hope that everybody listening to this will go to standforhealthfreedom.org.
.com.
It's even easier. standforhealthfreedom.com and sign up to get their alerts and be on top of what they're doing and make your voices count in a way that you just can't even imagine how powerful they are. So Leah, I want to thank you so much for being here with us today. This information is so important to get out. And so with that, I want to close with one of my favorite verses from the Bible. I close all of my podcasts with, whether they are live or pre-recorded, which is Romans 12:12. Rejoice in hope, be patient in trouble, and be persistent in prayer. Remember to lean into God. He will never let you down. His timeline may be different than yours, but he's always there with you. So we'll see you again tomorrow, 3 p.m. Eastern, right here on AmericaOutloud.news or iHeartRadio. You can also listen anywhere in the world using their media player at AmericaOutloud.news. You can find or on your favorite podcast platforms. You can also find more about me and all the things that we do, because we're involved in a lot of stuff. If you'll go to drtenpenny.com, where you can find my Substacks, my books, and please follow me on X. We need those numbers to grow, on Instagram and on X. And both of those, I'm at BusyDRT, Busy Dr. T. So with that, have a great rest of your day, everyone. We'll see you here again tomorrow or the next time at 3 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday, here at the Tenpenny Files. Have a good evening. Goodbye, and God bless.